has to do with making up the drill string when the Lucas gusher. I would, in my estimation, I think that's probably where it came from, is from the mining industry. But the development of rotary drilling for the oil industry, and that's the way it's done even yet today. It washes at the bit and then carries the cuttings up the space between the drill pipe and the casing. And so you can imagine the pressure you have to work when you're really on a big job, because you've got to not only push it all the way down, you've got to have enough pressure to push it all the way back up.
Now, so it's a matter of augering a hole or boring a hole. Then are the casings, how are they actually pounded? Is that the way I understood it? That a big piece of wood or whatever? Now, when they encountered the sand, the problem was the consistency, right? I mean, that every time they went in, it filled back in the hole.
Yeah.
Is that what was happening?
Well, whenever they shut down the pumps, when they would shut down the pumps, the hole would collapse. And more than once, it collapsed in around their drill string, right, and they almost lost their drill string down hole.
Couldn't get it out.
Yeah, they would have to pump and jerk it up and down, and literally, it would kind of like, well, like pulling a steak out of our South Texas gumbo. You know, you have to wiggle it and work it and jerk it up and down to finally get it worked free enough to where you could pull it up. But yeah, that's what would happen. For whatever reason, they would have to shut down the pumps. And another first that occurred on Spindletop was the use of drilling mud. There's one of those affectionate tales that the Hamels ran Charlie Ingall's cattle around the slush pit to stir up the mud, and realizing that the mud, as it flushed into these sands that they were encountering, that the mud would tend to stabilize the sand.
So almost
true or not, I imagine it's true to a certain extent.
Form a concrete type thing, or solidify the sand.
To solidify,
so they can keep
exactly, to solidify the sand and hold it in place so it wouldn't collapse into the hole. Yeah, fascinating tale.
You wrong? Do you think, David, that Patilla Higgins honestly knew what was underneath that hill? I mean, that he convinced these people in Beaumont to invest money, but did he really know?
Higgins couldn't have known. There was no way that he would know that there was oil under Spindletop. The technology of the day, up in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, you chased an oil seep by looking for sulfurous water and oil seeps. And out at Spindletop, we very definitely had the sulfurous water and flammable gas. I've often wondered if the chance exists that it might have been methane, just ordinary methane, swamp gas, that's a result of the biologic breakdown of organic matter. But fortunately for him, it apparently was natural gas. And he used to amuse his Sunday school classes by taking them out to the Spindletop field and poking a cane in the ground and then striking a match at the hole and burning the gas as it would come up out of the mud. Well, all of these factors combined, the sulfurous water, the flammable gases, and I've heard hints of oil seeps. Now, I've never seen a definitive report on it, but there are people that say that there were oil seeps. And for instance, off Sabine Pass, there were tales of oil seeps that when bad weather would hit the Gulf, that the sailors would head for the north end of the Gulf, knowing that off Sabine Pass the water would be smoother because of the oil. Well, I discount that. I've never seen any proof of it. But it's one of the tales that we're told. Well, back to Higgins. Higgins had gone to Pennsylvania to look at brick kilns. Why brick kilns? Because there was a market for brick down on the Gulf Coast. One of our major products down here was building material, wood, lumber. And so this community was very aware of what a market for building material could do for economic activity, and he wanted to establish a brick kiln. Well, the newest ones were firing with oil and natural gas. That is what introduced Higgins to petroleum as an energy resource. And reading up on how they did it in Pennsylvania, following the oil seeps, following the sulfurous water, the flammable gas, things like that, he became convinced that under this low rise of land called Spindletop, or Big Hill, that there was going to be an oil field there. And in his prospectus that he published before the field came in, He predicted that it would produce in millions of barrels. And he also predicted how deep the oil would be. Now, how could he have foreseen that? There is no way. He had convinced himself and went on to convince others, at least to the point where they established the Gladys City Company, hired a number of drillers. Higgins eventually had to sell out of the company sometime along about 1896, 97, possibly as late as 1898. Higgins was out of money and had extended his credit, and he had to sell out of the company, which left the only shareholder at that time was George O'Brien. And O'Brien kept the company, kept it intact. Higgins was the one, interestingly enough, now you got to remember, he's not a partner in the company any longer. He advertised in journals. I've never seen this advertisement. I don't think anybody really knows yet where it appeared. But he advertised for an oil lease operator to come take a look at this prospect with the idea in mind that they would buy a lease and then drill for all this oil. Well, that's what brought Anthony Lucas to Beaumont in 1900. Lucas came over answering this advertisement and looked at the Spindletop Dome, the big hill, and he elected to buy a lease. It's absolutely a fascinating tale, though, of Higgins, because Higgins wasn't part of the company. So why was he doing this? Well, one reason he was doing it, he still owned, I believe it was 17 acres out on the field, and had leases on other property. So there was the opportunity for him to get very rich if the field did come in. But back to your original question about whether he could have actually established that there was oil under Spindletop in the technology of that day, that was impossible. There was no way to identify whether Spindletop would contain a drop of oil.
Now, a lot of people would say perhaps he was a visionary. I mean, here was a man who went so far as to draw up maps and design outlays. I mean, wasn't he serious about founding a city?
Yes. Part of his prospectus included Gladys City. He had made out a map showing residential areas and parks and properties for schools and a college and an industrial park that was going to be fueled by his oil field. And the oil field was spotted with wells drawn in precisely as if laid out on a grid work. And this is, in fact, the Gladys City Boomtown, I know, still has a couple copies of the prospectus with his map. And he colored in some sections of it. Some sections were colored in so that the reader would more easily understand what he was proposing. Had a rail link to the main railroad lines, a model industrial community. And that was his vision. That was his vision. I've often wondered how he ever became so convinced that there was oil under Spindletop. It is beyond my understanding to find some sequence of logic that would have established this beyond just a dream. It had to be just a dream.
There were people, though, who at the time claimed that Big Hill or Spindletop had mystic powers, that it attracted people who went there one time. It seemed to bring them back for some reason.
Yeah, I think that goes along with the, well, okay, here's one of those digressions. Yeah, I have no doubt that there was some awareness of the field. What I think that stems from, though, is the awareness of Sour Lake for its healing capabilities. Put this in context, however. We're talking about the 19th century. Indoor plumbing is not a common feature of our society. Many, many, many ills could be cured with proper hygiene, rest, and a decent diet that would sustain for a few days on end. I'd be hard-pressed to name them, but I can think of a couple. How about eczema? How about other rashes and diseases of the skin? Dietary problems, dietary deficiencies are commonplace even today. But people would go to the hotel in Sour Lake and live there for a week or two or more and bathe in the sulfurous waters. Well, I have absolutely no doubt that the sulfurous waters at Spindletop were utilized to a certain extent in the same way. The only definitive reports that I've ever heard, though, were of the farmers that would wallow their cattle and pigs in the sulfurous water to rid them of ticks and fleas. But I have no doubt that people used the sulfurous water too, whether to just bathe in it or to drink it. But it was said too, some of the reports, some of the articles and reports and descriptions of the hill, you can find reports where it's described that the hill drew lightning. There's no way to know. I suppose that because it was a rise of land, that there may have been some gravitational anomaly working there, but it's never been established.
Don't they also mention St. Elmo's fire was seen on top of the hill? I even read an account where they said that at one time they thought there was a Confederate ghost image that the farmers would see at night above the hill, but as they approached it would disappear.
I remember reading a number of things about visions that were seen, and you mentioned St. Elmo's fire. St. Elmo's fire is related to lightning in the real definition of the expression. And after the field came in and all these wooden derricks were out there, there weren't a lot of trees out on the south or mid-county plains. At this time, in fact, old photographs reveal that you literally could see halfway to Nederland if you climbed up on top of one of the derricks because there were no trees. There were trees, but they were not. There was no forest of them like there is today. The Chinese tallow tree has literally engulfed that area down there. But back in the days when Spindletop came in, it was a grassy plain. Well, once the derricks were up, not only do you have a natural rise of land, but you've also got this spindly thing sticking up to the sky that in the midst of a storm would have acted as a lightning rod. But some of the reports precede the development of the field. Was it St. Elmo's fire? Was it swamp gas? There's fairly well documented accounts of swamp gas getting ignited naturally from lightning, perhaps, and sustaining for days on end.
Let me take you one step further. Talking about the Gladys City and the development, as you mentioned, Higgins eventually ran out of money and lost interest. O'Brien did not, though. What happened to the local? There was a board, I understand, of directors for the Gladys City Company. Were those people to go on to make money and fortunes in the oil business?
After the field hit, after the Lucas Gusher came in, there probably wasn't an individual or a family in Southeast Texas that didn't take the opportunity to invest in it, because immediately, well, perhaps should we say, within the first year, it was obvious that this was going to turn into a tremendous boom, that the most hardened skeptic had to be convinced that there was a market for oil, that this was a viable discovery, a major discovery. And if it wasn't for seeing the oil come out of the ground and being shipped away to market, it was seeing all of the big money come to Beaumont. All of the major players came to Beaumont. Beaumont swelled from a city of about 8,000 or 9,000 souls before the boom. By the year, sometime along in about the year 1902, the city of Beaumont is said to have exceeded 50,000 souls. And that growth occurred because of the discovery of the Lucas Gusher and the development of Spindletop. Well, you can have a huge pool of oil, but you've got to develop a market. Here in Beaumont, you had a very sophisticated community of people who were already developing a natural resource and sending it to a market. They understood this. They understood the use of a natural resource. All of the major lumber companies, all of the major families in Beaumont, the Weisses, the Keiths, the Carrolls, the Wards, everyone was involved in the lumber industry in some way. All of the big old family names that we can think of. And they understood that you could harvest a product, turn it into a marketable good, and then transport it to market and use it as a money-making device. Well, they saw oil. Once they saw how much was coming out of the ground, they realized immediately that this was a resource that they had to get into, that here was an opportunity. And many, many, many of our Beaumont families that got established in the energy industry because of Spindletop. An exceptional, a very important note is the McFadden family, because of course WPH owned a portion of the Spindletop field. And even yet today, his ownership is contested somewhat. You know, the Meadows heirs and the Humphrey heirs and all of these other people that are still claiming and either an erroneous or perhaps even an illegal transfer of title of property. All of that's been proven to have been they're false allegations. The transfer was entirely legal under Texas law. It's defensible today. But he owned a portion of the Spindletop field. And so that's, you know, once they got into the energy industry, why, of course, them and numbers of other people in Southeast Texas, why, that's when their awareness of the energy industry was born.
In retrospect, what is the significance of the discovery of oil at Spindletop? What made it different? What made the change?
Well, this is going to be a long speech. Settle in for the long one. The specific significance of the discovery of oil on Spindletop was the recognition and introduction of a whole new geologic horizon, the Gulf Coast and salt dome structures. Over the years since Spindletop and coming up through the 20th century, there have been something like 500 salt dome structures identified along the Texas Gulf Coast. And a lot of our offshore development is pinpoint salt dome development too. Whether you're drilling into the over the column of salt into an entrapment that's above the salt, or if you're going into the flanks that are alongside the column of salt, or in the case of High Island, the salt came up and mushroomed over, and the first oil entrapments that were discovered were underneath the mushroom cap. That's another tale. That's the Yant Lee Company in 1931. But going back to Spindletop in 1901, there was a major oil industry in the United States. Oil production had increased every year since the discovery, the first well that was drilled for oil at Titusville, Pennsylvania. Notice that qualification. See, I said drilled for oil because that's what its primary, the primary point of the Drake well was. It was an oil well. Well, since that time, there were a number of players that came into being, companies that were established. By the time we hit the 20th century, the principal player in the energy business in the United States is the Standard Company under the Rockefellers. Back to the books. Rockefeller? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, I'm sorry, excuse me. I just suffered a moment of self-doubt there. Well, the major player was the Standard Company under the Rockefellers, John P., I believe. And the way they achieved dominance in the field, and principally this was on the eastern seaboard, the big cities of the eastern seaboard, they controlled fully 85% of the pipelining and transportation facilities, and they also controlled almost all of the refining capacity. And controlling those two factors gave them a monopoly on the energy business. And now there were other players like the Continental Oil Company. We know them as Conoco. Conoco had already come into being and was already developing fields through the western states and on out into California. There were a number of other big companies. Atlantic Richfield had already been established. Sun Oil was already in business. But they were suffering at the hands of the Rockefeller interests, the standard interests. And and then not only that, but key that thought to technology. The technology of the day was finding oil in rocky formations. It was finding oil by having to drill through consolidated rock. Western Pennsylvania is highly eroded. The Appalachians, the Allegheny Mountains, it's a little far north to call them Appalachians. Okay, help me here.
We got to take it.
Oh, okay. Well, that gives me a second to think about this.
The
Yeah.
volume, I mean, wasn't that a great deal of the fact?
Suddenly they had a lot of it, but they
And
really didn't have markets at the time.
That's what I was going to talk, and
They-
you touched on that a little
Yeah.
bit about the fact that these people really created their own market, didn't they? I mean,
They had to.
You-
all you had at the time for oil was lubrication and illumination. I mean, and very little for fuel. There wasn't a whole lot going on. And part of the problem was the volume of oil that they had to that point.
Well, the Industrial Revolution was in hand, and you saw the use of oil as a fuel to fire boilers.
They're using coal for that, right?
They're using coal, and
Replaced coal.
you saw
Fuel age is something we've heard
a couple of things that occurred that were technologic advances. The Germans and the English were making changeovers in their battleships and their warships and in their commercial fleets to use oil. You got more BTUs, you could handle it with fewer people for a given space, and they were fueling their ships.
Okay, well, we weren't rolling. Let's go.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, the use of oil. As you come up into the 20th century, the Industrial Revolution is in hand, and you saw oil being used as a fuel for boilers. For instance, the German Navy and the British Navy were making tremendous advances in using oil to fire their boilers. The principal fuel up to then had been coal. And in a given space, you could carry far more BTUs of oil and fire your boilers with far fewer crew members. And so, of course, it made their ships much more efficient.
But I mean, from the point of discovery in 1901,
Okay. Well, in 1901, they were using it as a lubricating, a means of providing lubrication for lubricating oils and greases, paraffin wax. Other chemicals that were coming out of it included things like naphtha and benzene, and, of course, gasoline. But the principal market, in a domestic market, besides the industrial users, was kerosene. Up to that time, a good oil discovery would yield, out of the crude, it would yield as much as 50% kerosene. And the way it was made was literally distilled out. The day of reforming and that kind of thing was far in the future. But that's where it was. It was in kerosene. And initially, something to make note of here is that Spindletop was considered a very poor discovery because it was a sulfurous oil. And the oil, the technology to extract the sulfur and make it into a sweet kerosene was just then under development. The acidizing the crude to remove the sulfur.
Well, can I ask a question? Sure. Well, if that's true, then why was there the boom? If they didn't know what to do with the oil, and why did that happen? And why did people go, okay, there's a bunch of oil, but look at him when you answered. But I mean, that seems incongruous.
Well, there was a market. Although it sounds like individually we didn't consume a lot of the stuff. The principal means of lighting at the turn of the century was the kerosene lamp. There was a tremendous market for kerosene. But keep in mind that the Industrial Revolution is really coming along. High-speed machinery required good lubricants, and the best lubricants were made from natural oils, crude oils, petroleum oils like we know today, and greases to lubricate machinery. They're very important markets. And of course, things like solvents for making paints, finishes, other types of industrial processes that required petroleum-based chemicals. So it's a hand-in-glove situation where, although we recognize today that one of the primary markets for crude oil is for fuels, for direct use in motor vehicles, back in those days, it was a fuel, but it was for kerosene lamps and for the big industrial users. But there was a tremendous market for oil. Although I have to point out that the average price of a barrel of oil in those days was hovering down around $1.50 to perhaps $2.25 for a barrel of oil. But you had to provide your own barrel.
On that idea, the people like Guffey and Gates and a variety of other people who came in immediately, and I'm talking about days after this discovery, they created a market too, didn't they? Didn't they
Yes.
say, we'll build our own market?
Well, Guffey headed up the effort to establish the Gulf Company. Guffey got into this play because he was one of the wildcatters that Anthony Lucas went to get more money to continue his drilling effort. And it was after they were funded by Guffey and Gailey. And see, tie this back together now with the Mellon family. Guffey and Gailey were funded by the Mellon Bank out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The Mellons were familiar with the oil industry because, of course, they were right in the middle of it, and their W.L. Mellon, Andrew's nephew, had some experience in the oil industry. The Mellons funded this prospect through Guffey and Gailey, and that's what brought Guffey into a partnership with Anthony Lucas. And it was after the discovery of the field that Guffey became a major player and established the Gulf Company. What we know today, of course, is Chevron. And but it is entirely true that they were producing hundreds of thousands of barrels, approximately 42 gallons in a barrel times hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil. And they had no tankage, no pipelining, no loading facilities, and certainly no refining capacity. But if you read through the newspaper reports, follow the industrial reports of that day, they built and acquired those facilities very quickly. And it wasn't, you didn't see the end of 1901 before Spindletop was exporting oil to the refining centers of the Upper East Coast.
I want to step back. I want to go more towards an anecdotal thing, if you will.
Oh,
What was the
Guffey and
mood-
Gailey.
What was the mood of the town when all of a sudden these guys show up from Corsicana, start throwing pipe off in the middle of the prairie, as they called it, south of town? Here they were. I mean, was it a skepticism type thing?
Higgins was the one that was promoting this project. And the oil industry was unknown in Beaumont, Texas. In fact, one of the interesting tales is of the Hamill brothers having a carload of pipe, their drill pipe, shipped into Beaumont, and wanted to hire a contractor to offload this carload of pipe. And they didn't know how to handle it. Well, the Hamills just literally grabbed one end of a section of pipe and threw it off the car. And then he walked down to the other end and flipped it off the car. And he literally unloaded the car of pipe, one end of a section of pipe at a time. Used two sections of pipe to make skids off the car. To buy lumber for the derrick, George Carroll was a lumberman, and he offered the timber to build the derrick free. The Hamills, Kurt and Al, and their assistant Peck Bird, and I understand there was a fourth man whose name I don't recall. They literally had to build their own derrick. There was no one here that was familiar with the construction of a derrick. Guffey helped pick out the site where they would build it, and literally just walked out on the field and took a look around and picked a spot. How? If he had moved 100 feet to the south, do you know the Lucas Gusher would have waited a little while longer before it was discovered? It was that close to the edge of the field, to the edge of the what are known as the surface oil, the surface deposits. But the local people, they couldn't hire a man locally because they took one look at this strange piece of machinery with a boiler and a steam engine and all these whirling chains and this strange activity of boring a hole into the ground, and they just shied away from it. They were lumbermen and ranchers and rice farmers, and they had no interest in that. This had to have been. It would probably be analogous to perhaps. Oh, I can't think of a good analogy. Not today. I'm gonna have to think on this. What would be a good analogy?
Would it be the same skepticism as, say, perhaps with nuclear energy? I mean, that the miracle of fusion and fission, the idea. It appears to me in the papers they were pretty overwhelmed by this occurrence of oil shooting up from the ground into the sky, that this was a very wondrous thing that was happening. It was a geyser.
Well, that's subsequently, of course, the discovery of oil convinced everyone that they knew their business and knew what they were about. The Hamels were very solid technicians. They were good workers and innovated a number of things. But the drilling activity that took place out on the field, bear in mind that there had never been an oil well on the Texas Gulf Coast ever before. And so this had to have been a very strange activity, and the effort that these men put forth. They found that because of the collapsing sands and gravels, that they had to maintain their pumps each night instead of just being able to shut in and all three of them go back to their quarters to rest and have a meal. One man had to maintain the boiler and stay at the rig each and every night to keep the pumps running, to keep the mud circulating through the hole, to keep it from collapsing. So the people in Beaumont just their recognition of a viable activity of something that was a gainful employment. I'm sure they had many misgivings about what was going on out on the field. The fear of the machinery. There are reports that I've read, for instance, in the old Enterprise newspapers, the files on record out at Lamar, of tales that people literally were afraid of this drilling activity. But then after the well came in on January the 10th of 1901, they were absolutely convinced and went to church to pray for forgiveness, praying for these men's souls for what they had done. They were genuinely afraid of the scope, the scale, the enormity of this act, because this well, the derrick was 56 feet tall, not a small size construction in its day, and the oil, by the photographic evidence taken on January the 10th, the oil is more than doubling the height of the derrick, showering into the air, and there's no way to trap it. There's no way to capture it. It is literally shooting into the air out of this 8-inch casing, and the only thing they can do, at least immediately, is to throw up an earthen dike and catch what they can on the ground. You can imagine the range of emotions that this brought forth from the community. Some people were elated, some people were excited but wondered what it all meant, and some people were terribly afraid, because all they could see is that like pulling a cork out of a jug held upside down, that the whole thing would empty out. And what would happen then? They didn't understand, of course, that the gas and water drive is what was forcing this oil to the surface, and that the earth was not going to collapse and swallow them up. But there were a lot of fears about what it all meant.
Pretty soon, though, the curiosity got the best of them, didn't it?
Oh, yes.
People flocked very quickly.
Very quickly. It's interesting that within 10 days, the word of Spindletop had gone around the world, and in fact even appeared on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. This community, Beaumont, Texas, achieved a notoriety that even today we'd have to recognize how quickly the news and dissemination of information took place. And people were flocking to Beaumont. The Haywood brothers, they came to Beaumont specifically because of the oil boom. All of the other types of services, should we say, saloon keepers and ladies of the night, and people that had no interest at all in oil, but they were looking for an opportunity to make money on the crowds of people coming to Beaumont. Some of the more enterprising souls in Beaumont were small boys that found a way to make some money. They would collect pop bottles and other discarded bottles and fill them with Spindletop crude oil and stick a cork in, and they would sell them to the tourists for souvenirs. And as the boom built, services in Beaumont were overwhelmed. Sleeping space was at a premium, and toilet facilities were totally inadequate. And other small boys would rent their space in line. They would stand in line and sell their space in line to anxious visitors.
Now there was talk at a time. Someone said Beaumont will become the Chicago of the South because of this discovery. That it was so significant. Why didn't that happen? Why didn't Beaumont become the Houston instead of Houston? Or why didn't it become this major metropolitan area that everybody was forecasting?
Beaumont did become a very major city in Texas for a long time. We had major refining capacity. We had the largest refinery that the Gulf Company owned, located down on the ship channel in Port Arthur. The Texas Company established a major refinery, in fact their largest for many years, within a stone's throw of the Gulf refinery. There were a number of other refineries established. What would become Mobil was established right over on the banks of the Neches, where it is even today. And all of this activity continued to grow and to develop. And the population of Beaumont, long after the boom was over, the population of Beaumont was still sustaining at about 25,000 people. At that time, Beaumont was an economic center in Texas. But time is moving on, and so is the oil industry. The East Texas field came in. There were discoveries across central Texas. By the time you get up to about 1926, Burke Burnett is in, clean up on the Red River up in north central Texas. And by the time we hit the 1930s, why the Permian Basin has come in, the Santa Rita #1 will come in. And you saw a continued westward movement of oil activity. Now there was still a lot of activity here, but it was geared, once these facilities were in place, the oil was being piped in mostly. It was coming in, the crude oil was being transported in by pipe. It would be transported out both in a crude form as well as in refined product. But once the community of people and facilities were in place, there was no need to continue to make them grow. So Beaumont, because of its location, my thoughts on it are specifically because we were in very far southeastern Texas. We did not have access to the greater economic entity that was Texas, the cotton industry, the farming industry. The movement of goods and people required a more central port, and that port was Galveston and eventually Houston. And we are somewhat isolated here. The Trinity River is an effective barrier. Now, this community was a viable economic center, but our opportunity to develop markets, to develop contacts, didn't much exceed the Trinity River. It went mostly north from us. And the riverboat traffic, for instance, going through this area and going up the Neches River, going up the Sabine River, we never were an avenue to large population centers like you saw further west in Texas. And that's the reason why, because of the old realtor's expression, location, location, location.
What happened to Attila Higgins? I mean, you know, the story, of course, is he basically gave away the Gladys City Company, or had to get out
had to sell.
Of his situation. But what about after the boom? I mean, what happened immediately following this first well that started coming in?
Well, Higgins, of course, was recognized as being a visionary, and he enjoyed a great amount of success. He sued Anthony Lucas and the Gladys City Company in what must have been a very sympathetic suit for a good tidy sum. It was on the order of $400,000, and won some settlement. I guess he got his whole $400,000. But in 1901, $400,000 was a tremendous amount of money. Higgins was convinced that he was an oil player and went on to participate in many other fields. He had some activity over in Louisiana, but within a short time span after Spindletop, his big field that he participated in was Goose Creek, just this side of Houston, over by Pasadena. And Goose Creek was a major field, not quite as prolific as Spindletop, but it's been a much longer producer too. It's been a good producer.
He didn't die a broken man.
Oh, absolutely not. Higgins went on to develop many, many other fields and lived a nice long life. He was missing his left arm. As a boy, well, as a young man, he had gotten wounded trying to chivalry a church meeting, and an undersheriff came out and took a pot shot at these youngsters and hit him in the arm. Infection took his arm. The wound didn't, but the subsequent infection did. He was a very religious man. He taught Sunday school in Beaumont, and in fact, Gladys Bingham was a little girl, a 7-year-old girl in one of his Sunday school classes. And when he would eventually marry, he would marry a woman 30 years his junior. And Annie Higgins died not too many years ago now. In fact, I think it's about 5 or 6 years ago out in San Antonio that Annie Higgins finally did pass away. Higgins lived into his 90s. He was 96, I believe, at the time of his death in 1954. So he was in Beaumont for the 1951 anniversary. Again? I'm being too long with the Pearlstein building. Do you know that granite column that's just on the west side of the Southeast Texas Art Museum? That stood at the corner of the Pearlstein building.
Well, that building doesn't exist anymore.
Long gone. The WCTU building, which stood to the north of the Pearlstein building. You know, we could just keep on going, naming buildings that are gone, and it's so tragic.
Before we roll tape again, let's talk about the.
Hit on a bunch of things here. So
Okay, I'll try to shorten up and make.
just kind of,
I'm sorry.
Give us a refresh.
Really, if I'm getting too long, just go.
No.
Give me a.
What we're saying more, what I'm saying more or less is the impression. You know.
Okay.
That what you think is significant. First of all, the gusher comes in. People are just mystified. They come to this place. Soon, within just a matter of days, you had people coming from Pennsylvania, and I mean, they were the major players. We know where they came from. What happened immediately afterwards? I mean, was there a big land grab?
Yes. The field, people were literally trading leases without ever even going out to look at the property, without ever registering their find, their purchase. They wouldn't even go to the county courthouse to register their deed of lease. They would just trade it off. And people were making money hand over fist by buying paper and selling paper without ever determining if it was valid. And everybody got into this play. We talk about the Hamill brothers being such good drillers. They were also astute businessmen. The Hamill brothers stayed on Spindletop to continue drilling wells. And as a promotion, they sold a gusher for $6,000 with the property. The lease that they bought to sell with this gusher was 10 feet wide by 11 feet deep. They had to literally place the derrick on their neighbor's land to drill this well. And interestingly enough, if you can believe the account, it did come in as a producer.
How long was it between the first gusher, the next well that came in, that sort of thing?
Oh, you just stopped me, Dan.
Don't worry about that then, because we'll take care of that detail.
Yeah, that's in Spindletop. You'll find that tidbit.
When it got to the point where there were some very interesting anecdotes about the swapping and buying of land.
Mm-hmm.
Lucas held a big tract of land. What? Hog Swain was another.
Well, Lucas was part of the Gladys City Company. Higgins he owned 17 acres that I know of specifically. There were a number of other players. The ex-Governor Hogg, for instance, as you've mentioned, he was a big player here. And there were a number of smaller districts. The biggest one, where there was a real proliferation of drilling activity, was the Keith Ward district, the biggest on the field, with the greatest concentration of derricks in one area. A couple of the others included the Yellow Pine district and the Gober tract. But what was really mind-boggling was that all of these companies and all of these leases that were sold, some of them were out-and-out promotions. They were scams. They were confidence games. People would own a share of a well and would promote an oil company and would sell stocks across the nation. I had a specific report from the state of Minnesota, from the Attorney General's office, that they had a number of unclaimed oil stocks in state properties, wills that had, from probate and things like that, other kinds of properties that the state had gotten hold of for whatever reason. And I wrote to them asking if they had any stocks related to Spindletop, and they sent me a list of literally hundreds of stocks representing over 100 companies, and most of which we never heard of. And this just validated to me the scope of activity that took place, the promotions that were mounted to sell stock. And it was reported, and I think fairly reliably, that more money was poured into developing or buying into, ostensibly buying into Spindletop than was ever produced in oil. And I have no doubt that with all of the spurious confidence games that were established, that is probably true.
And things were happening. I mean, people would buy property 10 miles from Spindletop.
10 miles out.
Outrageous amounts of money.
Outrageous amounts of money. Something that many of the people in Southeast Texas would remember are the Meadows heirs. We've heard about them. We've seen them go to court. Met them. A number of us have met the Meadows heirs personally. The lands that they had under lease are nowhere near Spindletop. They're tracts of land that the closest one is in Nederland. The next closest one was clean out off Jap Road down in center South County. One of the parcels of land is clean out off of I-10 beyond Highway 364, and so that it just validates what your statement about the people buying properties, well, without ever considering where it was or the potential for development. But it's something else that did occur. why Spindletop was so important, because it did bring, it just proved the viability of an oil industry on the Gulf Coast. And after Spindletop, every little seep of oil or every sulfurous spring water brought drilling activity, and that's what developed Saratoga. The first field was Sour Lake, and Saratoga and Batson, eventually Big Hill, eventually Mont Belvieu, eventually Goose Creek, Damon Mound, Humble. All of these fields, I didn't get them in chronologic sequence, but all of these fields would see the drill. Every small knob of land along the Gulf Coast would have drilling activity on it in the next 10 years.
Now, there is a point made in a number of the different books that the space for drilling became so fierce on Spindletop and on the various tracks that you could actually walk for miles without ever touching the ground.
Well, walk for miles. The Spindletop field, make note of the fact now that Spindletop on its long axis, it's not quite circular, is only a little more than a mile across. But it is true that you could walk from derrick floor to derrick floor. In fact, there are specific tales of the derrick men, when they were working the rigs, that they would put planks across from one derrick top to the next as a safety escape route in case they had a blowout or a fire. That it would give them a means of getting out of their rig and getting over to an adjoining rig to get down. Their wooden rigs fired with open flame boilers. There's no gas loss seals or protection devices. The day of the blowout preventer is many years in coming. In fact, Cameron Iron Works came out of the Spindletop field, a company that never got into production but provided oil field machinery. It had to be very hazardous for the men working on the rigs. The chains that were driving the machinery from the steam engines to the drawworks, and then from the drawworks down to the rotary, were all open, just open chains whirling along. And at night, for illumination, at least in the early days of the field, they used kerosene lanterns, open flame kerosene lanterns. And so you can imagine the hazard that represented. Talking to Casey Jones, Casey's an old-timer, he's since deceased, but Casey's father established a moving business, a drayage business, Teamsters, because of Spindletop back in about 1911. And Casey moved many pieces of equipment, and he using mules and horses. And Casey tells of seeing mules that were killed by accumulations of hydrogen sulfide gas, that they suffocated.
Who were the people who worked the wells? I mean, where did they come? I'm talking about not the players, but the roustabouts, the guys who...
The roustabouts, the drillers.
The boomers.
All over. The principal source of experienced drilling people had to be the northeastern states, principally western Pennsylvania. But the other people that got into it and learned the business, they were people looking for cash work. They were people chasing the oil boom. They were farmers and ranchers and people from the cities that didn't have jobs. And men would literally leave their families and travel hundreds of miles to get into this oil play. Families that did that included, Jesse Pierce's family came to Spindletop. Jesse grew up on the Spindletop oil field. The reason that who's another good, for instance? Gosh, just everybody that you can think of.
But I mean, were they local people? Were they people from Batson, from the rice fields? Were the bulk of them coming from out of town?
Yes.
I mean, long distance.
Long distance. Well, yes, we know that just by the numbers. Beaumont was only about 8,000 or 9,000 souls, and by the time the boom reaches its peak, it exceeds 50,000 people, and they came from all over. They even came from overseas. They came from everywhere. Everywhere imaginable, people flooded to Beaumont because of the Spindletop oil boom. And many of them got into this play and were successful at it as the years went by and went on to drill in other fields. And some people were just, through personal experience, personal capability, never achieved any real influence or never established a business entity. But they stayed in the oil industry. Either they themselves or their families came to Beaumont, got work with one of the big companies, and stayed in the industry. A modern day example, Jim Schroeder out on the Spindletop field, he's the pumper out there. He started with the Unity Company in 1948. And the Unity Company was established by Scott and Walter Myers here in Beaumont and was a player out on the field, clean back in the days of, well, post-boom, but clean back in the days when Spindletop was still a big play. And he started with them in 1948, and he's still out there.
Calamity became a very big part of working on the field, didn't it? I mean, it was not unusual for people to lose limbs or fire or to have a gas blowout.
All of the horrific tales that you can find of people being exploited for commercial endeavor, all of that existed in the oil field. Kill a man, replace a man. Kill a mule, and it was costly. You could hire a man, but you had to buy a mule. Men were expendable. If you killed off a man, or if a man got injured, that was his problem. There was no social system intact to protect a worker that was injured on the job. The potential for fire was extreme. The machinery itself, the same technology that drilled the Lucas Gusher, steam-powered equipment, that's all that was available to subsequently develop the rest of the field. Hazardous working conditions, using open flame boilers to fire to provide steam for steam engines and steam-powered mud pumps to drill oil wells, none of which had blowout protectors on them. They were drilling through open-mouth wells. And so if you got a blowout of flammable gases, or if you got a blowout of, hopefully you got a blowout of oil, the potential for a fire was extreme.
Gases were a problem.
Yeah.
I mean, there were many times there was no odor, there was nothing to tell them that this is trouble. A lot of people died?
Well, exactly how many, you would have to go back and do a lot of research to pin it down, but yes, there are very distinct reports of people dying from suffocation. Now, on Spindletop, the gas was all loaded with sulfur. If you started smelling a concentration of sulfurous gas, you had a warning, much like our natural gas today has an odor in it. But you could still, even today, you can go out to Spindletop and find a tremendous concentration of hydrogen smell in the air.
What are the tales about the guys who say they went blind? You know, there were a lot of accounts of people who said they lost
The sulfurous gas would irritate your eyes, and the medical technology of the day, if you couldn't treat it adequately, you could literally lose your sight. But interestingly, it was Jesse Pierce's mother that ran an open-air kitchen on Spindletop in the days of the boom. She bought unrefined natural gas from one of the wells and ran it into burners to cook food, and the cooks that she hired would have to lave their eyes with iced tea to relieve them from the irritation from the sulfur that would come out of the gas as it was burning. And that by the end of the day, they just couldn't work anymore because their eyes would be so irritated from the sulfurous gas. So it wasn't just the drillers that were bothered with the concentrations of sulfurous gas, the hydrogen sulfide, and the natural gas loaded with the sulfur that would just escape into the air.
Read an account the other day about derricks collapsing because of trying to pull pipe out, and it would actually pull a derrick down, and that they were so close together that they would fall on top of each other.
never heard that one.
And that men would jump to safety or whatever.
Yeah. There were a man working up in the derrick. As the field progressed, derricks achieved about 60 feet high. They averaged mid-50s to mid-60s. There was no need to build them bigger because the field never went down more than about a little over 1,000 feet. There were no safety devices for the derrick man especially. For a platform, they would just lay planks across the horizontal members of the derrick, and that's where he worked. And a derrick man that would lash himself to the legs of the derrick was hooted at and derided by his fellow workers for a lack of courage. And so, it was considered very unmanly to use a safety line. And they didn't. They didn't. Scott Myers, not Scott Myers, excuse me. Oh, Scotty, what is your last name? Scotty Thomas. Okay, I'm sorry. One of the men that I knew here in Southeast Texas was Scotty Thomas, a Southeast Texan and a Beaumonter. And he worked on the wooden rigs out on Spindletop and was a derrick man at the mature age of 13. And one of his first encounters, one of his first confrontations with someone trying to force him to do something that would have been hazardous to his health, he relates that he picked up a Stilson wrench and threatened to bean the driller on the derrick floor for asking him to do something that was hazardous. And this is a 13-year-old boy working in a wooden derrick up on the monkey boards. Not for me.
Tom, can you think of anything else?
Oh, God, we can keep going on forever.
One other thing that interests me is what happened to the town. I know I keep coming back to that, but there was an interesting period of time. I mean, the buildings, the sudden proliferation of buildings. There was no place for people to sleep. There was, the railroad, I understand, was open 24 hours a day.
Yes. It is true that in Beaumont there was a genuine lack of housing. People were renting barber chairs to sleep in overnight, and they would rent space on a billiard table to sleep, to have a place to flatten out. And there are tales of people that would book overnight passage back to Houston and then the high-speed express passenger train back into Beaumont so that they could sleep on their way to Houston overnight and then boogie on back into town or hurry back into town on the express train in the morning. It is said that after the boom, in the decade after the field came in, that Beaumont saw 200 structures be built. Imagine some of them included very small structures, but many major buildings were built in downtown Beaumont specifically because of the oil boom. But even yet today, one of our very fine examples of oil boom wealth is the McFadden Ward House, built originally as the Averill House, open today as a museum, very fine structure, but a perfect example of the proliferation of wealth that struck Beaumont and enabled many people to enjoy an absolutely luxurious lifestyle.
Very strange situation, though. I mean, you have those who became very wealthy and those who were just making an existence.
Yes.
Blue collar versus...
Yes, that's so, but you've got to try to put this in a little bit of context. Even the people who were working in the field, if they wouldn't squander their money, were making tremendous wages. They were knocking down 4 and 5 and 8 and 10 times what a worker in industry was making. They could just, in the height of the boom, they could just darn near demand whatever price they wanted, and they could get it. The Hamill brothers went on to drill many more wells for other contractors. It's analogous to today. If you come up with a good idea and can find the funding and then enjoy a little bit of good business management and a little fortuitous good fortune, you can get established in business. Well, this presented an opportunity that exhilarated the availability of funds. It exhilarated the level of activity that you had to be prepared to meet. And the ones that harbored their resources, the ones that got into it early and actually established a viable play, enjoyed great success. But there were many, many more people that whose timing was off, whose business sense just was non-existent. One of those, we might point out, talking about the big companies that came into being, James Guffey established the Gulf Company. But Guffey did not have that overall scope, that overall awareness of the establishment of a major oil company. In order to get the product, to refine it, to transport it, to market it. And he wound up being bought out and literally being pushed out of the board of directors of the Gulf Company. And W.L. Mellon came in to reorganize the company, and that's the only reason, plus a major influx of new money from the Mellon interests to expand the company. That's the only way that the Gulf Company made it. It would have failed if the Mellon